Story 1. The Ghost Nurse. It was a night like any other at the hospital, until a patient started screaming desperately. When the nurses arrived, she was pale and trembling. The woman said she had seen a nurse in an old uniform next to her bed. The scariest thing? The description matched that of a nurse who had died there years before. Story 2. The room nobody wanted. On the 3rd floor of the hospital, there was a room that the patients avoided at all costs. They said that whoever slept there would wake up in the middle of the night hearing whispers that seemed to come from the walls. Once, a patient was found in shock, repeating that they wanted to take him away. Story 3. The elevator that stops on the wrong floor. A doctor recounted how he once got into the hospital elevator to go upstairs. Strangely, the elevator stopped on a floor that had been disused for years. The doors opened slowly, revealing a dark, empty corridor. The doctor swore he saw a figure in the background, but the floor was locked. Story 4. The child in the corridor. Nurses began to comment on a child who was seen playing in the corridors in the early hours of the morning. However, when they asked the parents about the child, nobody knew who it was. One day, a nurse decided to follow the girl, but she simply disappeared into the wall. Story 5. The spirit that calls by name. Patients and staff reported hearing their name being called while they were alone. The sound came from everywhere, and even when they looked, they never found anyone. This became so common that the hospital began to investigate, but nothing was found. Story 6. The man in the hat. During a night watch, a security guard saw a man in a hat standing at the end of a corridor. As he approached, the man began to walk into an operating room. The security guard followed him, but when he entered the room, it was completely empty. Story 7. The chair that moves by itself. In an empty waiting room, a wheelchair was seen moving on its own by a security camera. The guards rushed to the scene, but found nothing. The chair was stationary in the middle of the corridor, as if someone was sitting in it. Story 8. The missing patient. A nurse was looking after a terminally ill patient when he asked to be left alone for a few minutes. When she returned, the patient had disappeared. The windows were locked and so was the bedroom door. He was never found. Story 9. The flashing lights. In an abandoned wing of the hospital, the lights began to flicker every time someone passed by. Staff reported feeling a strange presence and heard footsteps, but never found anything. Story 10. The sound of the piano. In the early hours of the morning, a patient woke up to the sound of a piano coming from downstairs. When he asked a nurse about the sound, she turned pale. The piano had been removed years ago after a series of unexplained incidents. Story 11. The night visitor. Several patients reported that, during the night, an elderly woman visited their rooms, sitting by their bed and asking about their health. No one knew who she was, but everyone agreed with her description. When they investigated, they discovered that the description matched that of a patient who had died there years ago. Story 12. The phone that rings on its own. A phone in a boardroom started ringing every night, always at the same time. When someone answered, there was only silence on the other end. After investigating, they discovered that the number belonged to a former employee who had passed away, but the phone was no longer connected. Story 13. The shadows that appear. Employees reported seeing shadows that seemed to move on their own through the corridors. The most disturbing thing was that these shadows had no visible source, as if they were disembodied figures. Even with security cameras, they were never able to capture them. Story 14. The missing doctor. A doctor was on duty and left to pick up some tests. He was never seen again. Cameras showed him going into an elevator, but he never came out. The case remains a mystery to this day. Story 15. The cradle that rocks by itself. In a pediatric ward, nurses began to notice that one of the cribs was rocking on its own in the early hours of the morning. There were no drafts or any apparent reason. Some said it was the spirit of a child who didn't want to leave. Story 16. The hand that touches your shoulder. Patients and staff report feeling a cold hand touching their shoulder when they are alone. When they turn around, there is never anyone there. This has become so common that even the most skeptical have become suspicious. Story 17. The cry from the corridor. A patient reported hearing a cry coming from an empty corridor in the early hours of the morning. When he went to investigate, he found the corridor completely empty, but the sound was still there. He ran back to his room and never wanted to talk about it again. Story 18. The room that nobody opens. There is a room in the hospital that has been locked for decades. Senior staff say that after an unexplained incident, the room was sealed off. Those who try to enter report feeling a suffocating presence and immediately give up. Story 19. The elevator that won't stop on the first floor. An elevator at the hospital started acting strangely, taking people to the wrong floors and suddenly stopping between floors. The scariest thing was that sometimes it would stop on a non-existent floor, where the doors would open into a complete void. Story 20. The patient who knows too much. A terminally ill patient began to describe details about the personal lives of staff that no one should know. He mentioned facts that could only be known by someone who was watching them all the time. Everyone was frightened, because there was no way he could have known these things. Story 21. The reflection that isn't yours. Employees reported that when they looked in the mirror, they saw reflections that were not their own. Sometimes it was an older version of themselves. Other times it was as if someone was behind them, but when they turned around, there was no one there. Story 22. The door that knocks on its own. One night, a door at the end of the corridor began to slam repeatedly, as if someone was slamming it shut. On investigating, the guards found no one, and the door was locked. Even so, the sound continued. Story 23. The scream from the operating room. Surgeons and nurses reported hearing screams coming from a closed operating room. When they entered, no one was there, but the sound of surgical instruments falling and the smell of ether hung in the air. No one could explain what was happening there. Story 24. The swaying bed. Patients reported feeling their beds swaying at night, as if someone was trying to move them. When they turned on the light, everything seemed normal, but the feeling that something or someone was there remained. Story 25. The voice asking for help. One night, a nurse heard a desperate voice calling for help in one of the empty rooms. When she went in, she found the room empty, but the voice was still asking for help. She ran out, and to this day can't explain what she heard. Story 26. The song that plays by itself. Hospital staff began to hear soft music, like a lullaby, coming from one of the unoccupied rooms. The sound was reassuring, but at the same time disturbing, as the room was empty and there was no visible source for the music. Story 27. The picture that changes expression. In the waiting room, there was an old painting with the portrait of a hospital doctor. Patients and staff reported that the face in the painting changed expression, looking more serious or even sad, depending on the time of day. Some even swore that the eyes in the portrait followed them. Story 28. The faceless patient. A nurse on her night shift was called to check on a patient who was lying on his back. When she turned him over to give him his medication, she was horrified to realize that he had no face, just a smooth, featureless surface. She blinked, and the next instant he had disappeared. Story 29. The shadow that appears in the window. At night, a shadow is often seen in the window of a room on the top floor of the hospital. The curious thing is that this room is disabled and the window shouldn't be accessible. However, the shadow keeps appearing, as if someone is watching what happens outside. Story 30. The cupboard that opens by itself. In a supply room, the cupboards began to open by themselves during the night. Employees started locking everything with keys, but still found the doors open and the items out of place in the morning. Story 31. The trail of blood. A security guard was doing his rounds when he found a trail of fresh blood down the corridor. He followed the trail to a closed operating room. When he opened the door, there was no one inside, and the blood had mysteriously disappeared. Story 32. The hand in the mirror. An employee went to the bathroom and, as she was washing her hands, she saw in the mirror a hand appearing next to her head, as if someone was approaching from behind. She turned around quickly, but there was no one there. The hand disappeared straight away. Story 33. The rocking chair that never stops. In a geriatric ward, there was a rocking chair that never stopped moving, even when no one was around. Some nurses believed it was the spirit of an old woman who had died there, and who continued to rock the chair as she did in life. Story 34. The ghost doctor. Some patients reported being seen by an old-looking doctor in clothes from decades gone by. He would ask questions and even prescribe medication, but when the patients mentioned his name to the staff, they were confused, because that doctor had died many years before. Story 35. The endless corridor. An employee was leaving her shift late at night when she decided to take a shortcut down a less-used corridor. She walked for minutes that seemed like hours, but the corridor seemed endless. Finally, she ran back the way she came, and the corridor was back to its normal size. Story 36. The clock that stops at the same time. In a rest room, there was a wall clock that, every night, stopped at exactly 3:13 in the morning. The scariest thing was that at that time, many strange incidents began to occur in the hospital. Story 37. The invisible patient. Nurses reported hearing the sound of a hospital bed moving and someone's breathing, but when they entered the room, it was empty. The bed seemed to have been used, but there was no sign of who might have been there. Story 38. The sound of footsteps on the roof. During the night, patients and staff heard footsteps on the roof of the hospital, as if someone was walking heavily. However, when they went to investigate, they found no one, and access to the roof was restricted. Story 39. The icy touch. A patient reported feeling an icy touch on her face while she was asleep. When she woke up frightened, she saw a misty figure next to her bed, which disappeared as soon as she shouted for help. Story 40. The haunted waiting room. Patients waiting in the emergency room reported seeing strange figures in the reflection of the windows, who were not present in the room. Some even saw their own distorted images, as if something was trying to manifest itself through them. Story 41. The patient who never wakes up. A patient fell into a coma after an accident and was placed in a special ward. The strange thing was that, every night, other patients in the same ward reported seeing the comatose man walking down the corridors, although his body remained inert in bed. Story 42. The elevator leading to the basement. An elevator in the hospital started taking people down to the basement, even though no one had selected that floor. The basement was full of old and forgotten equipment, and many reported feeling a dark presence when trying to get out. Story 43. The silent nurse. During the early hours of the morning, patients reported seeing a nurse who moved silently through the corridors, without speaking to anyone. He would enter the rooms and watch them, but never touch anything. No one knew who he was, and when they tried to talk to him, he disappeared. Story 44. Crying in the bathroom. In one of the hospital bathrooms, it was common to hear the sound of a child crying. But when someone entered, the sound stopped immediately and the bathroom was empty. Some people reported feeling a deep sadness when they left that place. Story 45. The room that gets cold. Patients reported that, in certain rooms, the temperature dropped dramatically during the night, to the point where they could see their own breath. The hospital investigated problems with the heating, but nothing was found. Some believe it to be the presence of disturbed spirits. Story 46. The singing nurse. During the night, some people heard a nurse singing an old song in the corridors. The voice was soft, but at the same time frightening, as it seemed to come from all directions at once. They were never able to identify who it was. Story 47. The figure at the end of the corridor. A doctor, on his nightly rounds, saw a dark figure standing at the end of the corridor. He thought it was some lost patient, but when he got closer, the figure disappeared into the darkness. He has avoided that corridor ever since. Story 48. The shadow on the window. During a storm, a nurse looked out of the window and saw a shadow standing outside, even in the pouring rain. The shadow seemed to be looking directly at her, and as she moved away, the figure disappeared. Story 49. The sound from the floor above. Employees began to hear noises of furniture being dragged on the floor above them, but when they went upstairs to investigate, the floor was empty and disabled. The sound continued every night, always at the same time. Story 50. The disappearing patient. A patient in critical condition was under observation when he suddenly disappeared from his bed. The security cameras showed no one entering or leaving the room. Hours later, the patient was found in another wing of the hospital, in a state of shock and unable to explain how he had got there.